So on this chat, let's talk about travel. I'm going to talk a little bit about travel out of country, Manitobans traveling out of Manitoba, other people traveling into Manitoba, and cover what are the different rules that you can expect. So for out of country, the most clear rules are around travel to the US because that border is closed apart from essential business. So if you fall under, transportation of specific goods, so for truckers who are bringing in food, for example, you can still move past the border as per usual. But for any sort of recreational leisure type travel, it's just closed. So you are not permitted to go into the US as a Canadian, regardless of whether or not you live in Manitoba, for anything other than essential business. So that was pretty simple. Other countries, the borders may or may not be closed. You have to look at each country individually. But what's very clear is that if you do go to any other country, when you come back to Canada, you, by law, it's a federal act, you have to quarantine for 14 days. And the RCMP have been checking in on people to see whether or not they're quarantining, to make sure that they have good plans in place for how they're going to quarantine. So as I've mentioned in a previous video, quarantine is a legal term, and it's based on the federal act, so you do have to do it if you come into Canada from another country. Within Manitoba, there is a public health order that requires anyone traveling into Manitoba to, now we call it self-isolate for 14 days. It's the same thing as quarantine, we just call it self-isolate because it doesn't fall under the Federal Quarantine Act. So that is a public health order, not the Quarantine Act, and whether you're a Manitoban or somebody else, anytime you come into Manitoba, you are expected to self-isolate for 14 days unless, again, it's essential travel. So again, for things like truckers, for people who are coming into Manitoba to fix medical equipment, if you're a flight attendant, these types of things, you're not required necessarily to self-isolate, although we still want those people to be watching their symptoms really carefully, and to maintain as much physical distancing and as much isolation as they can, but not a total requirement for self-isolation. So when it comes to the summer, people are asking about cabins and campgrounds, and can I leave the province to do that? Can you go visit family in another province? So you are, as a Manitoban, allowed to leave Manitoba anytime you want. And the public health order doesn't stop you from leaving Manitoba. It just puts rules on what happens when you come back. So if you have family in Saskatchewan that you want to visit, you can do that, but you will be expected to self-isolate for 14 days when you get back to Manitoba. There are some exceptions if you're going to a close community across the border for an essential purpose, somewhere you go regularly and you're visiting your own property. And the government has so far been interpreting visits to cabins that are just over the border as one of those exclusions. So theoretically, the interpretation from the government is that you could go to a cabin that's in between Kenora and the border, so long as you're not interacting with anybody there. So you're not going into Kenora, you're not going shopping there, you're just going to your cabin and coming back. Unfortunately, the order itself talks about accessing your own property. So if you were going to a campground, much less likely that would be allowed without the 14 days of isolation. So for example, if people are thinking about going to Rushing River on the east side of Kenora, you're now past the border community and you don't own the property and it's not a regular trip and it's not essential travel. So that would most likely be interpreted to require 14 days of self-isolation when you come back. Not really fair that people who can afford to own cabins get to go to their cabins, but people who have to rent campgrounds don't get to go. But that's the state of the order, and so these things may change, interpretations may change. That's where that's at today. For visitors to Manitoba, let's say you have a friend coming in from Calgary or a family member who wants to come and see you, they would be required to self-isolate for 14 days before they can come and see you. So that makes that really tricky. They might be able to self-isolate in your home, but really they're expected even in your home then to be completely isolated from you. And so that would be very challenging to do and kind of unrealistic to expect that your visitor would be able to do that here. So Visits from friends and family from out of province to here would be very challenging because of the requirement that they self-isolate for 14 days when they're here. So that's the state of things right now. If you live in a border community and let's say you're working just over the border in Saskatchewan, that's regular travel, it's essential, that you'd still be allowed to do without being expected to self-isolate. Additionally, there's exceptions for things like healthcare appointments. So if you were coming from Northwestern Ontario because you have an appointment with a specialist in Winnipeg, you wouldn't necessarily be expected to self-isolate. You could just come, go to your appointment, and go back. Now, if you stayed to visit people, now that's no longer part of the essential visit, so you would be expected to self-isolate. So you can't really add on a social component to your visit to Winnipeg. It really is about the healthcare appointment and then going back. So it's confusing, but reach out to me if you have specific situations and I'll try to keep answering them because I keep getting lots of questions about cross-border issues. Yeah.